What is proportional representation? Help us understand that
Sure.
first basic point.
So the reason why nobody understands what it is because it's actually a really complicated question. The simple version doesn't get you all the way to a solution. The simple version being, if everybody voted for a party, then there would be equitable distribution between the votes for parties and the seats in parliament. However, we don't vote for parties. We have a system, single member plurality, first past the post, which makes it roughly equivalent to voting for parties. So you can do the same calculation. You can say, you voted for this person, they're a member of this party, therefore you voted for that party, which isn't really true, but it's close enough to being true that I don't tend to complain about that too much. That's the basic idea of proportional representation. You can measure it. There's a bunch of different metrics to use for that. Gallagher index is probably the most popular. And it just compares like the percentage of each party you get and the percentage of each vote you get and how closely those sets of ratios combine together. The problem being is that voting for parties is somewhat opposed to the concept of a representative government. If you read Considerations on a Representative Government by John Stuart Mill, he talks a lot about how we are enfranchised with the right for representation, and we delegate that representation to another person who goes and represents us. And that's supposed to be kind of a from me to my representative to the government. Once you start voting for parties, then it becomes a top-down thing, and who gets to be that specific individual representative loses that connection, it loses that individual touch. It's relatively easy to come up with a PR system when you're voting for parties. When you're voting for people, it's pretty hard. And there's two basic sources of disproportionality. One would be vote splitting, and we can solve that in a number of ways. Go to approval or star or score or whatever you want. But that's not going to get you to full proportional representation because there could be a party that say has 10% across the board for the entire country in every district, and they don't win any seats because they don't have enough to win a seat in any riding. So to compensate for that, you actually have to share information between different districts in order to do some sort of a calculation to make it match this idea of proportional representation. However, if you want to get rid of vote splitting, you're not voting for a single person, so you don't have that one-to-one link between the person and the party, so the original calculation no longer works. And so you have to come up with a new calculation which has kind of the same spirit. And this is where everything really goes sideways, because there's a whole bunch of different definitions, and some only apply for ranking systems, some only apply for cardinal or scoring systems. I tend to like winner set stability, but I'm going to phrase that. Jameson would probably say that's a bit too much of a purist definition, or something you probably wouldn't use those words, but that's kind of a very balanced way of viewing it, whereas he favors something that's more about so there aren't words for these things, so it's very difficult to describe. He wants each party to be as well represented as possible. And so you want people deeper or more polarized in each group, whereas I would tend to favor something where people can kind of be balanced between parties, and it's more of a kind of an amorphous blob, and you count this towards this and you count this towards this. And the systems each of us have invented somewhat represent that distinction, and we can get into specific systems there. But that's proportional representation. And so the issue is that you can measure it in some cases, you can define it in a half dozen different ways, and everybody tends to not agree that these systems that they don't favor are proportional. So sometimes people will say STV isn't proportional because it passes the hair quota criteria and it passes a bunch of other criteria, but it's not proportional in the sense that, say, party list would be proportional. But I would say if we're going to define proportional in a good way, then partisan voting isn't representative. So if you're after representation, you want representation of people by people, not of people by parties. So, you get into this debate and it gets really muddy really quick.